Welcome to Sleeping Boring Histories tonight. I invite you to lie back, close your eyes, and let yourself drift slowly into sleep as I share an exceptionally detailed and perhaps delightfully boring account of the administration of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century of the Common Era. This period was marked by crisis, instability, and gradual administrative change. But it was also a time of immense complexity and meticulous bureaucracy, designed to hold together an empire that stretched thousands of kilometers, encompassing diverse peoples, languages, and cultures. Over the next 2 hours, we will explore this administration in excruciating detail. We will consider the emperor's role, the provincial governors, the military organization, municipal structures, economic management, and even religious policies. All of this delivered slowly, carefully, and with many digressions, perfect for helping you drift off to sleep. Let us begin with the historical context that gave rise to these challenges and changes. The 3rd century of the Roman Empire, spanning roughly from the years 200 to 300 of the Common Era, was a time of significant upheaval, often referred to as the crisis of the 3rd century. This term, used by modern historians, describes a period in which the Roman Empire nearly collapsed under the combined pressures of civil war, foreign invasion, economic depression, and plague. Between 235 and 284 CE, the empire saw an extraordinary turnover of emperors, by some counts over 26 legitimate rulers, not to mention usurpers and rival claimants. It all began with the assassination of Emperor Severus Alexander in 235 CE. Severus Alexander, known for his relative moderation, fell victim to mutiny among his own troops. His death ushered in an era of near-constant military revolt, in which generals were proclaimed emperor by their legions, only to be overthrown or killed by rivals in short order. This instability had profound administrative consequences. Central control weakened as individual provinces and military commanders assumed greater autonomy. In some regions, local leaders had to negotiate with invading groups independently, or raise their own armies because the central government in Rome or Mediolanum lacked the capacity to respond quickly. At the same time, foreign invasions intensified. Along the northern frontiers, Germanic tribes such as the Alemanni and the Franks crossed the Rhine and Danube more frequently. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire, a formidable rival, pressed hard against Roman defenses, capturing key cities like Antioch, and even briefly taking the Emperor Valerian prisoner in 260 CE, a humiliating event unmatched in earlier Roman history. Internal fragmentation also occurred. The empire effectively split into rival states. The so-called Gallic Empire, centered in Gaul, Britain, and parts of Hispania, broke away under Postumus and maintained independence for over a decade. In the east, the Palmyrene Empire under Queen Zenobia challenged Roman authority, controlling Egypt and parts of Asia Minor. Economic problems compounded these issues. Coinage was debased repeatedly, leading to rampant inflation. Trade networks were disrupted by insecurity, piracy, and civil war. The government struggled to maintain grain shipments to urban centers, and famines occurred sporadically. All of these crises forced the Roman administration to adapt, though the process was often halting and inconsistent. New military structures emerged, such as the division of field armies and frontier troops. New taxation mechanisms developed to extract more resources from a stressed population. Administrative regions were sometimes subdivided to improve control. It is important to recognize, however, that these changes did not happen uniformly. Different emperors attempted different reforms with varying success. For example, the Emperor Gallienus, who reigned from 253 to 268 CE, excluded senators from military command, centralizing authority among equestrian officers. Meanwhile, Aurelian, ruling from 270 to 275 CE, reconquered the breakaway regions and introduced monetary reforms, though inflation remained a chronic problem. In this context, the emperor's role evolved from that of the principate, originally designed as first among equals, toward a more overtly autocratic and militarized leadership. Court ceremonial became more elaborate. Titles and honors multiplied. The bureaucracy grew in both size and complexity. This transition set the stage for the eventual reforms of Diocletian at the end of the century, which will also be part of our discussion later tonight. But before we arrive there, we must examine the administration of this troubled century in all its parts. We will now turn to the first of these aspects in detail: the imperial government itself, the emperor, his court, his titles, and his immediate administrative apparatus. We have now reached the end of part 1, our long and detailed exploration of the administration of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. Through crisis and chaos, emperors, governors, soldiers, city councils, and ordinary citizens struggled to maintain the structures that held the empire together. Their efforts combined tradition and innovation, coercion and negotiation, resilience and fragility. Despite repeated invasions, civil wars, economic collapse, and even plague, the empire did not fall in this century. Instead, it adapted, imperfectly, unevenly, but persistently, laying the foundations for the profound transformations of the late Roman Empire. Thank you for listening to this extended and perhaps suitably soporific account. May these many details and digressions have helped you drift into restful sleep, or at least into a calm and contemplative state. Until next time, for part 2, rest well and good night. Let us now consider in painstaking detail the imperial government of the Roman Empire during the 3rd century of the Common Era. At the very center of Roman administration stood the emperor himself. Officially known as the princeps, meaning first among equals, this title carried a republican veneer, dating back to Augustus. But in reality, by the 3rd century, the emperor was an unmistakable autocrat. Yet even the nature of imperial power evolved during this century of crisis. Early in the century, emperors continued to emphasize the older, principate model. They claimed to be merely the first citizen, the guardian of tradition. Coins and inscriptions preserved this language of continuity and moderation. But as crises multiplied, rebellions, invasions, secessions, the emperor's role transformed into a military monarch, a commander of armies above all else. The term dominus, meaning lord or master, began to appear, especially in court settings, reflecting the emperor's growing authority and ceremonial distance. Titles were an important part of this evolution. Emperors adopted elaborate honorifics, such as Pius, Felix, Invictus, and even titles claiming universal dominion, like Restitutor Orbis, meaning restorer of the world. These titles were not simply vanity. They served as propaganda, reassuring subjects of the emperor's legitimacy and divine favor. The emperor's person was sacrosanct. Even in times of chaos, this principle endured. Treason laws, known as majestas, criminalized insults to the emperor, conspiracies against his life, or any act interpreted as disrespectful to his authority. Punishments could be severe, including confiscation of property and execution. Around the emperor clustered an elaborate court. The imperial comitatus, or traveling entourage, included generals, advisors, secretaries, bodyguards, and courtiers of various ranks. The emperor's court became increasingly formalized over time, with rigid protocols for audiences, greetings, and ceremonial appearances. The comites, literally meaning companions, were trusted officials appointed to accompany and advise the emperor. Initially an informal title, by the later 3rd century, it became a more formal administrative designation, with comites assigned specific duties such as managing finances, military logistics, or diplomatic missions. One of the emperor's most important administrative tools was the cancellarius, or imperial secretary. The cancellariat managed correspondence, issued edicts, and ensured imperial commands reached the proveni. We now turn our attention to the provinces of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. This subject may at first appear straightforward, but in fact it reveals layers of complexity, administrative nuance, and regional variation that help us understand how such a vast empire attempted to govern itself. The Roman Empire at this time was divided into numerous provinces, each with its own governor, staff, military presence, and system of taxation. Provinces varied tremendously in size, population, economic importance, and strategic value. Egypt, for example, was immensely wealthy, serving as a critical source of grain for Rome, while frontier provinces, like Dacia or Syria, required large military garrisons. Let us begin by considering the formal divisions. By the early 3rd century, under Severus Alexander and his predecessors, there were roughly 40 to 45 provinces. These divisions were not static. New provinces were created by subdividing larger ones, either to improve administrative efficiency or to prevent any one governor from controlling too large an army. For instance, Moesia, along the Danube frontier, was divided into Moesia Superior and Moesia Inferior. Similarly, Pannonia was split into Pannonia Superior and Pannonia Inferior. These divisions aimed to prevent rebellious governors from amassing excessive power, a constant fear in an era of usurpation. Governors themselves fell into 2 broad categories, senatorial and equestrian. Senatorial provinces were traditionally more stable, peaceful regions without heavy military presence. Their governors held the title of proconsul or legatus pro praetore. Africa proconsularis is a classic example, a wealthy grain-producing province overseen by a senatorial proconsul. In contrast, equestrian provinces, often on the frontiers, had governors of the equestrian order with the title praefectus or procurator. These men were typically career administrators or military officers, seen as more directly loyal to the emperor. Egypt, notably, was governed by an equestrian prefect, the Praefectus Egypti, reflecting its critical strategic and economic role. Emperors did not trust senators with Egypt's wealth. The powers of a provincial governor were extensive but carefully defined. They served as the emperor's representative, commanding any legions stationed in their province, administering justice, overseeing taxation, and maintaining public order. They issued edicts, heard legal cases, managed local councils, and enforced imperial policy. Military command was especially critical in frontier provinces. A governor might command 1 or more legions, auxiliaries, and local militia. The legate of Upper Pannonia, for example, had to coordinate defenses along the Danube against Germanic incursions, ensuring forts were garrisoned and supply lines maintained. Civil administration, meanwhile, included managing the collection of taxes. Tax revenues came in many forms: land taxes, poll taxes, customs duties, and special levies. Governors worked with local officials to ensure assessments were fair, at least in theory, and payments were collected and sent to the imperial treasury. Communication was a major challenge. Governors relied on the cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, to send reports and receive instructions. This system used relay stations and official couriers, who could travel quickly but were limited in capacity. Delays were common, especially in times of war or rebellion. Urban centers were administrative hubs. Each province typically had a capital city where the governor resided. In North Africa, Carthage served as such a center. In Syria, Antioch. These cities housed the governor's staff, archives, and courtrooms. They also symbolized Roman authority with their forums, temples, and baths. Staffing a provincial government required a range of officials. The governor might employ a cornicularius, chief of staff, a commentariensis, record keeper, a beneficiarius, military aide, and other clerks. These assistants maintained records, handled petitions, organized military movements, and collected taxes. Local elites played an essential role in administration. Roman policy depended on cooperation with municipal aristocracies. In return for privileges and status, local notables served as decurions on city councils, collected taxes, maintained roads, and provided for public buildings and entertainment. This partnership extended imperial authority deep into the countryside. The 3rd century's instability strained these relationships. Rebellions and invasions damaged cities, disrupted tax payments, and reduced local willingness to cooperate. Governors often had to negotiate, threaten, or cajole local leaders to fulfill obligations. We should also note the role of itinerant imperial inspectors, known as curatores. Emperors dispatched these officials to investigate provincial administration, audit finances, or resolve disputes. While intended as an anti-corruption, let us now turn our attention to the military administration of the Roman Empire during the 3rd century of the Common Era, a topic of considerable complexity and crucial importance for understanding how the empire struggled to maintain its frontiers in a time of almost constant crisis. By the beginning of the 3rd century, the Roman army had already undergone centuries of evolution. The legions remained the backbone of Roman military power, but auxiliary units, cavalry contingents, and naval forces supplemented them. During this period, these structures faced severe strain, leading to improvisation, reform, and ultimately transformation. The standard legion of the early 3rd century still nominally comprised around 5,000 to 6,000 infantrymen. Each legion was divided into cohorts and centuries, commanded by centurions who formed the backbone of discipline and daily administration. The senior officer of the legion was the legatus legionis, usually of senatorial rank in earlier periods, though by the mid-3rd century, equestrian officers increasingly filled this role. Supporting the legions were the auxilia, non-citizen troops, granted citizenship upon discharge. Auxiliaries provided critical cavalry, archers, and specialized infantry. They were often stationed along frontiers, familiar with local terrain, and played a vital role in reconnaissance, raiding, and frontier defense. Command structure was hierarchical yet flexible. Provincial governors commanded legions within their provinces, but in the times of crisis, emperors often appointed special commanders with imperium maius, superior authority over multiple provinces. This arrangement sometimes caused friction among generals vying for power, contributing to the frequent usurpations of the century. Military administration included not only commanding troops, but also recruiting, supplying, and paying them. Recruitment often drew from local populations, especially in frontier provinces. Veterans settled in colonies provided both manpower and a Roman cultural presence, though declining population and economic troubles made recruitment increasingly difficult. Supply lines were critical. Armies required vast quantities of grain, weapons, equipment, and pay. The annona militaris was a form of tax in kind. Provinces provided supplies directly rather than money. Organizing the system was a major administrative challenge, especially when invasions disrupted agriculture or transport. Fortifications along the frontiers, known as limes, were a key component of defense. The Rhine and Danube frontiers featured networks of forts, watchtowers, and roads enabling rapid communication and movement of troops. In Britain, Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall marked similar defensive lines. These systems required constant maintenance and garrisons, straining the imperial budget. The 3rd century saw increased pressure along all frontiers. Germanic groups such as the Franks and Alemanni launched raids across the Rhine. The Goths attacked the Danube provinces, even reaching as far as Greece and Asia Minor. These incursions forced emperors to spend much of their reigns on campaign, personally leading armies to repel invaders and suppress internal revolts. Emperors such as Gallienus recognized the need for more mobile field armies. He is credited with creating the comitatenses, or field units, distinct from frontier garrisons. These mobile forces could respond to invasions quickly, while the limitanei, frontier troops, held defensive positions. Though not fully formalized until the 4th century, this distinction began in the mid-3rd century as an adaptive measure. Gallienus also excluded senators from a military command, promoting equestrians and career soldiers instead. This professionalization aimed to reduce aristocratic rivalry and ensure loyalty, though it further alienated the senatorial class. The army's loyalty remained a double-edged sword. Soldiers often made or unmade emperors. The phenomenon of the barracks, emperors, military commanders, proclaimed emperor by their troops, defined much of the century. The Praetorian Guard in Rome, too, continued to play kingmaker, assassinating or selling the throne to the highest bidder. Military discipline, recruitment, and pay all faced crisis. Coin debasement eroded soldiers' salaries' real value, sparking mutinies and demands for donatives. Large cash bonuses offered to secure loyalty. Emperors were forced to mint increasingly debased coins or levy extraordinary taxes to meet these demands. Field armies had to be recruited from wherever manpower was available. Barbarian federates, non-Roman groups settled within the empire in exchange for military service, became more common. This policy provided soldiers, but created challenges of loyalty and integration. Logistics were similarly strained. The cursus publicus facilitated communication, but could not always guarantee supply. Armies on campaign had to live off the land, requisitioning supplies from local populations, a practice that alienated subjects and devastated the countryside. Naval forces remained active, but limited in scope. Fleets patrolled the Mediterranean, the Rhine, and the Danube, transporting troops and protecting grain shipments. However, piracy increased, especially in the eastern Mediterranean, requiring local commanders to deploy naval squadrons creatively. Emperors recognized the importance of their personal presence with the army. Successful rulers like Aurelian and Probus led their troops directly, defeating invasions and rebellions through decisive campaigns. Yet such dependence on charismatic leadership was inherently unstable, as the death or assassination of an emperor could plunge the empire back into civil war. The military administration thus oscillated between reform and crisis. Ad hoc measures solved immediate problems, but failed to create lasting stability. The seeds of later reforms were sown: more mobile field armies, professionalized officer corps, separation of military and civilian authority. But these changes were incomplete and uneven. Indeed, by the century's end, the empire's defense system was a patchwork of improvisation. Fortifications were rebuilt and abandoned. Armies were recruited, disbanded, and reconstituted. Commanders balanced loyalty to the emperor with their own ambitions. The result was a military system in constant flux, reflecting the empire's broader instability. And yet, despite these challenges, the Roman military continued to function. It repelled invasions, reconquered breakaway regions, and maintained order in many provinces. Its officers and soldiers showed remarkable resilience and adaptability, even as they contributed to the empire's political fragmentation. As we move forward in our discussion, we will next consider another vital component of Roman administration: the municipal structures that connected imperial authority to local communities, ensuring the daily functioning of cities, towns, and rural estates throughout the empire. We now turn to another crucial dimension of Roman administration in the 3rd century: the municipal level of government. While emperors, governors, and generals often receive the most attention in historical narratives, the daily functioning of the empire depended in large measure on its cities, towns, and rural communities. Roman administration was deeply urban in character. The city, or civitas, was the basic unit of local governance. Each province contained numerous cities of varying size and importance, from great metropolises, like Carthage, Alexandria, and Antioch, to small municipia and coloniae, scattered across the countryside. Municipal government was conducted by local elites, wealthy landowners, merchants, and professionals who formed the Ordo Decurionum, or city council. Membership in the decurionate was both a privilege and a burden. Decurions enjoyed local prestige, tax exemptions, and a measure of political influence, but they were also responsible for ensuring the city's obligations to the imperial government were fulfilled. These obligations included collecting taxes, maintaining public buildings, organizing markets and festivals, and recruiting soldiers when needed. Tax collection was perhaps the most burdensome. Cities were collectively responsible for meeting their assessed quotas, which meant that if some citizens defaulted, the decurions themselves were required to make up the difference from their own fortunes. This system placed immense pressure on local elites, especially during the 3rd century's crises. Inflation, invasions, and civil wars disrupted trade and agriculture, reducing tax revenue while demands from the imperial government only increased. Some decurions sought to escape service altogether, prompting emperors to issue laws making membership in the decurionate hereditary and compulsory. The city council, or curia, typically ranged from a few dozen to over 100 members depending on the city's size and wealth. These councils elected magistrates such as duumviri, aediles, and quaestors, who oversaw judicial proceedings, public works, markets, and finances at the local level. Elections, while theoretically democratic among the decurions, often reflected local family alliances and patronage networks. Public buildings served as both practical infrastructure and symbols of Roman civilization. Basilicas provided space for legal proceedings and commercial dealings. Forums served as central marketplaces and meeting places. Temples honored the gods of Rome and the local community, reinforcing civic identity and loyalty to the empire. Bathhouses, aqueducts, and theaters provided leisure and demonstrated Roman engineering prowess. Urban planning reflected Roman ideals of order and civilization. Streets were laid out in grids, with paved roads, drainage systems, and public fountains. Even smaller towns sought to emulate the architectural forms of great cities, building triumphal arches and colonnaded streets when resources allowed. Local elites competed for prestige through acts of euergetism, voluntary public generosity. Wealthy citizens paid for new temples, baths, or city walls, funded games and festivals, or provided food distributions in times of scarcity. In return, they gained honorific titles, statues, and inscriptions praising their generosity. This system of mutual obligation and local pride bound communities together and connected them to the imperial framework. The emperor's image adorned city gates, temples, and coinage. Imperial cult worship, with altars and priesthoods dedicated to the emperor's genius and numen, reinforced loyalty while giving cities a share in imperial ideology. But the 3rd century's disruptions strained these institutions. Invasions destroyed towns or forced populations to flee behind fortified walls. Economic decline reduced the ability of local elites to fund public works. Repeated demands for taxes and recruits emptied city coffers and alienated citizens. Some cities attempted to fortify themselves more heavily, building new walls or reinforcing old ones. Urban centers along the frontiers often became small fortress towns with diminished civic life. Even in safer regions, local pride sometimes waned as public buildings fell into disrepair and festivals became less elaborate. Yet municipal structures endured. Even in times of chaos, emperors continued to issue instructions to city councils, confirming privileges or appointing curatores to oversee finances. Inscriptions and papyri record legal cases brought before local magistrates, edicts regulating grain supplies, and petitions seeking tax relief. The resilience of urban administration reflected its deep roots in Roman society. While governors commanded legions and enforced imperial edicts, it was the municipal councils that gathered taxes, maintained order, and kept daily life functioning. Without them, the empire would have collapsed much sooner. By the century's end, reforms began to formalize and control these institutions even more tightly. Diocletian's legislation in the early 4th century made decurionate membership hereditary, attempting to lock local elites into their fiscal responsibilities permanently. But in the 3rd century itself, the system remained in flux, adapting as best it could to unprecedented challenges. Local communities also served as vital nodes of communication. Imperial edicts, laws, and tax assessments flowed outward from the emperor to governors and then to city councils, who in turn enforced them among the populace. Likewise, petitions and reports traveled back up this chain, informing the emperor of local grievances, disasters, or loyalty. The urban landscape also helped integrate the empire culturally. Latin and Greek inscriptions, Roman architecture, and shared rituals of citizenship gave diverse peoples a common identity, even as regional variations persisted. In summary, the municipal administration of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century combined tradition and adaptation. Rooted in centuries of urban governance, it faced the pressures of invasion, economic decline, and imperial demand, with remarkable, if imperfect, resilience. Through city councils, magistrates, local elites, and civic pride, the empire maintained a fragile but persistent order in a time of crisis. As we continue our examination, we will now explore another essential dimension of administration, the empire's economic management in the 3rd century, including taxation, currency, trade, and efforts to control inflation in an era of severe financial strain. Now let us examine the economic administration of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century, an essential but often overlooked aspect of its survival during this time of crisis. The Roman economy in this era faced severe challenges. Decades of civil war, foreign invasions, plague, and political instability disrupted trade routes, devastated agriculture, and strained the imperial treasury. Yet even under these conditions, the empire sought to maintain a functioning economic system, to supply its armies, feed its cities, and fund its bureaucracy. Taxation remained the primary means by which the imperial government raised revenue. The most important direct tax was the tributum soli, or land tax. Assessed based on land ownership and productivity, it fell on landowners large and small. Assessments were carried out by provincial officials in cooperation with local city councils, who often faced the thankless task of collecting taxes from their neighbors. Another key tax was the tributum capitis, or poll tax, levied on adult males in many provinces. This flat-rate tax was deeply unpopular, and its collection could provoke unrest, especially during times of economic hardship. Customs duties were also significant. The porteria was a tax on goods transported across provincial boundaries, or through certain ports and roads. Rates varied, but these duties provided vital revenue and were collected at established stations by tax collectors known as portitores. In addition to these regular taxes, extraordinary levies were often imposed during military emergencies. Known as indictiones or ad hoc requisitions, these could include both cash and goods, placing further burdens on communities already struggling to meet their annual quotas. One of the most distinctive features of 3rd century taxation was the shift toward payments in kind. As the empire's currency debased and inflation soared, the government increasingly demanded grain, oil, wine, cloth, and other supplies directly. This system, known as the annona militaris, when destined for the army, allowed the state to feed its soldiers, even when cash lost its value. Coinage itself tells the story of the 3rd century's economic crisis. Successive emperors debased the denarius and antoninianus, reducing their silver content dramatically to mint more coins and pay soldiers. What had once been a relatively stable silver currency became a largely bronze token with a thin silver wash. This inflation eroded savings, disrupted commerce, and undermined confidence in the monetary system. Prices rose steeply, and barter became increasingly common in local markets. The imperial government responded with repeated currency reforms, but these typically failed to restore lasting stability. Trade networks were disrupted by insecurity. Invasions and civil wars made travel dangerous, cutting off traditional routes between East and West. Piracy increased in the Mediterranean, threatening grain shipments to Rome and other large cities. Some regions became more self-sufficient out of necessity, while others faced shortages. Urban centers suffered as trade declined. Merchants faced new risks and costs, while artisans struggled to maintain supplies of raw materials. Even so, some trade continued. Alexandria still exported grain. North African estates shipped oil. Eastern workshops produced textiles and luxury goods, though on a reduced scale. To maintain grain supplies to Rome, the government relied on the annona system, a complex supply chain involving requisition, storage, shipping, and distribution. Egyptian grain, North African oil, and other supplies were transported across the Mediterranean in state-controlled ships. Grain was stored in large horia, or warehouses, and distributed to urban populations through regulated channels. Managing this system required numerous officials. Procuratores anonae oversaw requisitions and storage. Naviculari, or ship owners, bound by public duty, transported supplies, often at their own expense. Even in the crisis of the 3rd century, this system staggered on, albeit with frequent shortages and emergencies. Price controls and regulations were also attempted, while the most famous example, the Edict on Maximum Prices, dates to Diocletian in the early 4th century. Earlier emperors issued edicts regulating grain prices and punishing speculation. These measures had limited effect and often led to black markets and hoarding. The government also intervened in labor. In certain sectors, such as shipbuilding, mining, and state factories, workers could be bound by hereditary obligation, colony attached to the land, naviculary bound to transport grain, and fabri assigned to imperial workshops. These policies reflected a growing command economy as the state sought to ensure critical supplies, despite labor shortages and unrest. Local economies adjusted as best they could. Villa estates in the West became more self-sufficient, producing food and goods for local consumption. Urban markets shrank but did not disappear. Barter replaced coin in many transactions. Meanwhile, local elites struggled to maintain their revenues while meeting their tax obligations. Despite these difficulties, the imperial government did not abandon its economic administration. Provincial governors continued to assess and collect taxes. City councils labored to meet quotas, even as members tried to evade service. Imperial officials enforced requisitions, directed supplies to armies, and maintained communication across the empire's vast distances. This combination of improvisation, coercion, and tradition kept the imperial economy functioning, imperfectly, often brutally, but with enough success to sustain armies, feed cities, and prolong the empire's survival. As we continue, we will now turn to another dimension of administration in the 3rd century, the religious administration and the role of the imperial cult, local temples, and emerging tensions with new religious movements. Let us now consider the religious administration of the Roman Empire during the 3rd century, a subject that illuminates the deep cultural ties that bound the empire together, as well as emerging tensions that would shape its future. Religion in the Roman Empire was profoundly public and civic. Temples, altars, festivals, and rituals reinforced social cohesion, affirmed civic identity, and expressed loyalty to Rome and the emperor. Local cults flourished alongside officially recognized gods, creating a rich and varied religious landscape. One of the most important aspects of imperial religious administration was the imperial cult. Emperors were honored as divinely favored rulers. Their genius, or protective spirit, was worshipped in temples and at household shrines. The cult of the emperor served as a unifying ideology, proclaiming loyalty to Rome and its leadership. Provinces maintained temples dedicated to the imperial cult, often built at provincial capitals. These temples hosted annual assemblies where provincial representatives gathered to honor the emperor, discuss local issues, and reinforce their status as loyal subjects. Priests of the imperial cult, sometimes drawn from local elites, presided over sacrifices and festivals in the emperor's name. Cities and towns also maintained local temples and priesthoods for traditional gods, Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Minerva, as well as local and syncretic deities. These temples were centers of civic life. Their construction and maintenance reflected civic pride and the generosity of wealthy benefactors. Festivals punctuated the calendar, blending religious devotion with social and political functions. Games, races, theatrical performances, and sacrifices honored the gods and entertained the populace. These events reinforced local identity, while also showcasing loyalty to the empire. Religious administration was not centralized in the modern sense. Instead, it was dispersed among cities, temples, priesthoods, and local councils. However, imperial authorities did intervene, especially when religious practices threatened public order or challenged imperial authority. This became increasingly significant in the 3rd century with the growth of Christianity. Christians refused to participate in sacrifices to the emperor's genius or the traditional gods, rejecting the civic rituals that symbolized loyalty. This refusal was seen as subversive, threatening the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, on which Rome believed its success depended. While persecution of Christians was sporadic earlier, the 3rd century saw intensifying efforts to enforce traditional worship. Under Decius, around 250 CE, all inhabitants of the empire were ordered to perform a public sacrifice and receive a certificate, or libellus, proving compliance. Many Christians refused, leading to arrests, executions, and the first empire-wide persecution. Valerian continued these measures in the 250s, ordering clergy to sacrifice or face punishment, confiscating church property, and executing prominent Christians who resisted. Yet these persecutions were inconsistent and often locally enforced, depending on governors' zeal or imperial priorities. At the same time, traditional religious practices adapted to the empire's crises. People turned to mystery cults, such as those of Mithras or Isis, promising personal salvation and communal belonging. Divination, astrology, and magic flourished as people sought answers to the empire's seemingly endless troubles. Temples sometimes fell into disrepair due to economic strain, while others remained well-funded through local donations. Even emperors continued to present themselves as pious, restoring temples, sponsoring festivals, and issuing coins with traditional religious imagery. Religious administration thus combined tradition and adaptation. It maintained civic order, enforced loyalty through the imperial cult, and responded, often harshly, to new movements that threatened established practices. Yet, even in persecution, Christianity continued to grow, laying the foundations for future transformations. As we proceed, we will now examine the crisis responses and reforms attempted by emperors in the later part of the 3rd century. A final effort to save the empire from fragmentation and collapse. Finally, let us consider the crisis responses and reforms undertaken in the 3rd century, particularly in its later decades, as emperors struggled to stabilize a fracturing empire. The period from roughly 260 to 284 CE was marked by extraordinary efforts to recover lost territories, restore authority, and rebuild the empire's administrative structures. This was not a single coordinated reform, but rather a series of adaptations, improvisations, and partial solutions. One major figure in this period was Emperor Gallienus. Following the capture of his father Valerian by the Sassanids in 260, Gallienus faced a divided empire. The Gallic Empire had broken away in the west, while the Palmyrene Empire under Zenobia controlled much of the east. Gallienus concentrated on stabilizing Italy and the Balkans, reforming the army by creating more mobile cavalry units and restricting senatorial command. After his assassination in 268, a succession of short-lived emperors continued the struggle. Claudius II Gothicus achieved victory over the Goths, earning his cognomen Gothicus, but died of plague. Aurelian, ruling from 270 to 275, proved the most successful crisis manager. Aurelian reconquered the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east, restoring nominal unity. He fortified Rome with massive new walls, reformed coinage to improve silver content, and attempted to stabilize food supplies. He also promoted the cult of Sol Invictus as a unifying religious focus. His assassination in 275 plunged the empire back into turmoil, but his efforts set the stage for later reforms. Probus, another capable emperor, fought Germanic tribes, improved frontier defenses, and settled defeated peoples as farmers within imperial lands. All these measures were pragmatic responses to crisis. They aimed to restore order, secure borders, improve military mobility, and ensure food supplies. Yet they remained piecemeal, vulnerable to further civil wars and invasions. The culmination of these crisis responses came with Diocletian's accession in 284. Though technically outside our period of focus, his reforms responded directly to the 3rd century crisis. Diocletian reorganized provinces, established the Tetrarchy, restructured the army, and attempted to control inflation through price edicts. These reforms sought to address the century's central problems: usurpation by powerful generals, overmighty governors, an overstretched military system, and a fragile economy. By subdividing provinces and separating civilian and military authority, Diocletian aimed to reduce the threat of rebellion. By creating a formal tetrarchy, he attempted to share power and improve governance. Though imperfect and short-lived in some respects, these reforms marked the empire's transition from the principate to the so-called dominate, a more openly autocratic, bureaucratic, and militarized state. In this light, the 3rd century appears as both a time of collapse and adaptation, a crucible in which the Roman state was transformed to meet new realities.